Welcome to the Ascend Leadership Monthly, the last webinar of this series. And today, my goal is for us to bring it all together, but in a way that kind of comes together for you, like your brand as a leader. So, throughout this series, the discussions, I've tried to root them in how leaders show up, because as leaders, how you do, how you say, how you decide, how you react, those hows are just as important as what you say, sometimes even more so. You know, that statistic that people hear 7% of the words coming out of our mouth, something like that. It's that saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. It's like that. And true leadership is experienced. It's not something we watch from afar, right? At the end of the day, your impact as a leader is measured in outcomes. Those outcomes are the result of the way people you lead come together, work together, and collaborate to get things done. So when leadership inspires great results, strong connections, when it lifts people up, it's magic, right? Okay, I'm being a little dramatic, but it's true, right? The energy that drives results is the secret sauce. And it's what inspires people to follow you. And that's why my favorite leadership quote, you'll hear me say this all the time, is the one from Peter Drucker, where he says, the only definition of a leader is someone who has followers. And I love this because it boils leadership down to the outcomes of that energy that I was just talking about. It's not the title, it's not the role, it isn't about how other people experience you. That, my friends, is the heart of a leadership brand. And that's what we're diving into today. But I'll tell you, getting there requires us to take a different path than the one you might expect, because a leadership brand isn't exactly something we create per se. It's something that we become aware of and then we shape intentionally. So it's like a personality, right? You can't create one for yourself, but with reflection, maybe getting some feedback, being open, a touch of humility, right? We can understand how our personality is affecting those around us. And sorry, not just what they think of us, but what it feels like for them to be around us. The good stuff, great, that's easy. The hard stuff, those unintended ways we impact other people, not so easy. But with some intention and that touch of humility, we can work toward being that best version of ourselves, right? So to put this in leadership terms, it's to lead true to our values, aligned with the vision of who we want to be. So before we talk about all of that, though, we need to go back to understanding where our understanding of leadership began. What are those deep-seated beliefs, the narratives, the expectations, including the unconscious stuff, right? It's all behind everything we do. And because how you lead today, it's shaped by what leadership has meant to you long before it became your reality and your responsibility. So today, I told you we're going to take a bit of a different route. Today is about intentional leadership identity, understanding how the who you are, the how you're experienced, and the how we lead converge over time to create your brand as a leader. I'm Janai Tiem. I'm a 26-year plus career veteran, if you will, public accounting. I'm a CPA, but now I'm a speaker, a trainer, and a consultant. And my work is something that I call, my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion. I define that as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. So I develop workshops and trainings focused on the inner work of leadership, authenticity, intentionality, conscious communication. And today is all about that inner work, right? My passion is helping business professionals and leaders build deep connections, cultivate safety, and thrive as inclusive, mindful, and trusted leaders. The series is built around the Ascend leadership model, which I created to reframe how we think about leadership. There are many views and approaches and definitions for leadership. Position, title, right? I talked about those. Maybe it's somebody's capacity or it's an action, like in the context of the work you do. And those are all true, but they focus on like activities. None of that matters if people just see you as the boss, but they're not really seeing you as a leader, right? I describe leadership as an outcome. It's that Peter Drucker quote, blah, 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 right? It's the impact we create and the trust we build. Ascend, though, isn't just a model. I want you to think of it as a mindset. It's a way of showing up, and it's foundational to the way I try to live my life and as a leader and to teach leadership. Because what I want us to do is connect who we are with how we lead. Vital if we want to truly understand and evolve our leadership brand. So this gives you a framework for sort of examining, understanding, and reflecting the patterns, the habits, and behaviors that are your signature. They are your style. They're the core of your brand. So if we look across this model, we can try to get a more nuanced understanding of how we show up. Because leadership doesn't show up in just one way, or it shows up in how we lead ourselves, how we connect with others, how we navigate uncertainty or take action, right? And so we're going to show up differently in all of these ways. So what does that mean for us in terms of our overall brand? So at the end of the webinar, I'm going to actually walk you through the process. And I'll let you know now, there's a handout. Let me click the handouts tab. And it's the Ascend Leadership Brand Worksheet handout. Okay, good. I wasn't sure what it was named. So there's a handout in there. It walks you through this process, and I'm going to walk through it with you. So if you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to download that so you can follow along when we get there. So let's start with definitions. I always like to start with definitions. It gives us a shared foundation. We're working from the same understanding. Now, the dictionary defines a brand as something that we're like marketing and promoting. So it's that image that we want to project. Think of this like you're developing a character in a play that you're writing about someone who's a good leader, right? What's the image you want them to project? So what this definition does is it focuses on who I think I'm supposed to be as a leader. I almost said should be as a leader, but I caught myself because should is a dangerous word. It carries judgment, expectation, risk. It replaces defining things on your own terms with defining things on someone else's terms. So when we're thinking about our brand, should not be part of our vocabulary, even though I just kind of used the sentence. I was trying to recraft that sentence. Never mind. A brand is asking me to think about the image of me that I think will be trusted, respected, promoted. As CPAs, those are very important values and signals that we want to put out there in the world, just in terms of our professional brand, and even more so as leaders of our organizations, leaders of our teams, and for many of you, thought leaders in the industry. So what we're thinking about here is ideal state when we're talking about brand and promotion. That's not necessarily a bad thing. Visioning is good, and it can be really useful. The danger here is that what we don't want to do is feel like we are trying to become a character in a play that we are writing. I hope that makes sense. All right, let's flip to the other side of it. Oh, sorry. No. So let me break this down. I was jumping right into the next topic. So when I talk about, that projection, this is really that constructed identity. So if we zoom in on that definition for a moment, we have public. So what's important about this one is that this isn't an internal reflection of you per se, because it's the picture you're trying to put out there in the world. A picture where you're trying to create their perception of you, right? In the play analogy, it means creating the character that you want the audience to see as the right leader for the story that you're writing. Second one is conceived. And what this means is that part of this picture is actually going to be designed by you, designed as in calculated, planned, deliberate, right? In the play analogy, this is where you're building out the character, maybe giving her a backstory. You have to think through what is her lived experience and her leadership style. This will give you context for the actual script and directing the performance, right? I say this like I'm a screenwriter or write scripts. I don't. I'm an accountant, remember? But I have a vivid imagination and I'm not afraid to use it. So humor me. And if you do right, how am I doing? Okay, so the third one, the number 3, this is about pushing that narrative to support that image. Back to the play analogy one more time. This is where we are actually writing the script. So how the character sounds, what are their facial expressions, what are their word choices, that's the kind of thing. We need to know this if we're going to direct the performance. It's how we want her to perform that role. So that's what we mean when we're thinking about branding. Reputation is the other side of this coin. The dictionary definition, it's based on the other person's impression. It is not about you. I mean, it is, but it's about them looking at you. Have you ever had someone say, right after you were introduced, the first thing they say is, your reputation precedes you, right? And I kind of think of that as a little terrifying. You know, I think about how it activates that imagination I was talking about. And then like I start scanning through the files in my brain, right? To think, what are the things you're picking up on and putting in my, what do I call it? Reputation file to figure what does that mean? And it's a good thing or a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily mean, it can mean both, what I'm saying. So like the context, it could be a good thing. Let's say I'm doing a keynote and I'm in a conference and I'm being introduced to the MC who's going to introduce me, right? Nice, that's a good, your reputation type thing. But what about that networking event? Someone who doesn't really know you well is introducing you to someone, and then they say that thing about their reputation, and there's this tone in their voice. It almost sounds as if they were just talking about me. Not so nice, right? In both situations, I'm trying to figure out what they're seeing. I'm trying to get into their head so I can see me through their eyes, right? That's really hard to do. It's hard, almost impossible, if you will, to figure out what somebody else is seeing. What I want to see my reputation for myself, but at best I can try to understand it and I understand it through the impact that I'm having, responses I'm getting, the experiences I'm seeing of those around me. This is particularly true as a leader. So your reputation, it develops over time, and there are a couple of different things involved. So it's relational. This means it's based on your actual interactions. It could be direct, you and me talking, and it could also be someone recounting an experience with me. And when they do that, the person they're sharing that experience with is now starting to build that impression, right? It's observed. It's people watching what you do. They're watching what you say and what you don't say, right? In some cases, like let's say you stayed silent when you missed an opportunity to speak up for somebody. It's watching for that. It evolves over time. We have habits, routines, and patterns. We have preferences. We have defaults. And over time, they kind of create that backstory for people to give depth and nuance to the meaning behind our actions. Which gets us to interpret it, right? It's a reflection of how other people are interpreting what we're doing. There's intention and then impact, two different sides of the coin. Our intentions are guiding us on terms of what we want to accomplish, but the impact on the other side of it, that's what we're seeing here in terms of that interpretation. They're watching those nonverbal cues, context, timing, mood, etc., right? They are assuming motive so they can guess our intention, so they interpret our actions. And then the last note here about resilience is that reputations, they take a while to build, but they can be fragile, and erode really quickly. You say the wrong thing at the wrong time to the wrong person and give the wrong impression, and it undermines your reputation, and it can feel like it's broken. The flip is that a bad reputation, maybe I should say a poor reputation, can be repaired and restored. It just takes time and intentional, purposeful effort. So the bottom line here then is at the end of the day, the difference between a brand and a reputation is perspective. The brand is the experience you're trying to create. The reputation is the experience they're actually having, right? Brand is our intention, impact is reputation. They actually come together when we start to talk about and use phrases like professional brand, leadership brand, and we'll talk about that, right? But we had to start this conversation by defining brand. And so next, we need to define leadership, only that one's a wee bit more complicated. Defining brand was relatively easy. Now, before I do, I'm going to pop over to the Q&A because I do like to sort of take these things as we go, if we can, make it a conversation, if you will. Scrolling, scrolling, scrolling. That's my scrolling song. Okay. Let me see. Somebody says, and I'm not sure what time this came in, but so who I think I am or who I want them to think of me as? Both. And who do I think I am? What are my values? How do I show up, right? All of that awareness is what we call internal self-awareness. Who I want them to think of me as? Well, understanding how other people see us, how other people perceive us, how other people experience us from their lens, that's external self-awareness. And so this isn't an either or. We actually need to understand both of those things if we really want to get a sense of how we're showing up as leaders. It'll all come together at the end. Jane asks, are these good things? I don't want to be scripted every day. Jane, I'll ask you to do me a favor and add in another question so I know what these are you referring to, because I didn't see this coming in real time. All right, so let me pop back in over here and let's talk about the definition of leadership. And here's the thing. It's not like you didn't know what it was until they taught you the word in school. Like there's no vocabulary class, right? We acquire language through experience long before we ever hear a formal definition. And leadership is no different, right? We start to internalize leadership at a very early age, long before the competency models and the leadership frameworks and all of that. We've been watching TV, right? We've been listening to music. We've been observing what's happening at the playground. We learn by hearing words in context, like a conversation or a story. It could be social interactions. We're watching the parents who are organizing that play group. We're inferring meaning through repeated exposure, right? So as kids, we see a situation, we see someone in authority, we see how they respond to that situation, and we attach meaning to it. And we see that over and over again. Over time, what do we notice? Who gets listened to? Who gets rewarded? Who has the power? How do they use that power? Who gets to be called a leader? Who doesn't, right? All of these observations of all of those authority figures are the beginnings of how we learn leadership, and they become part of our subconscious processing. And it's always there, always running in the background, outside of our conscious awareness, kind of like, the computer processing software. It's there. You need it to be there for the computer to work, but hopefully you don't know it's working. Wait. Yeah, I'm going to stop with that analogy before I get hurt. Okay, so why is this important, right? Along that association journey, like as that starts to develop, right, we create archetypes in our minds for how leaders should behave. This isn't because someone else told us, at least not yet, right? And what this does is it helps us identify someone as a leader. And this is critically important because it's then the initial frameworks for how we then view ourselves as leaders, which is important if we want to be able to understand our leadership brand, right? So we construct what I wrote here, silent standards, quiet standards of what leadership means, the expectations and what it looks like. And over time, it tells us who we think a leader is, what we think they should look like. And like I said before, well, do we see ourselves as leaders? What are we doing? How do we judge that leadership quality in others? Eventually, we get this, formal list of traits somewhere along the way. It's like they're codified, the traits of leadership, but these are ideal states. And often these traits, there's a bit of a disconnect between the ideal state in this list and what we've learned and observed and experiences. It's part of why some of us hesitate to call ourselves leaders if we're imagining a leader to be something that different than what I'm being told, if that makes sense. This disconnect is critically important to understand in developing our brand. Now, how does this come to be? Well, so when we talk about learning those associations over time from childhood and they carry on to where we are today, we eventually start to learn the meaning of words, right? We get to know what leadership is. You learn about it in school. It's talked about even in, I don't remember, was there a class in college? I don't think so, but that was a minute ago, right? But so it's not as if we don't know what leadership is by the time we enter the workforce. But what happens? As we mature professionally, we're learning more technical skills, we're taking on new responsibilities, and simultaneously revisiting those silent definitions of leadership. We are starting to reconcile from our actual experience here in the workplace, the observed behavior versus what I've experienced and read about up until this moment. We're deciding which of these models we want to hold on to or reject. Sometimes we claim them and reframe them for our own, right? We're codifying our own list of leadership traits, if you will. So this process is what I call leadership maturity. So what happens, and so I created this graphic that I'm going to walk you through here that tries to show the parallel progression between our progression through roles, moving up in our career, and how that influences and changes and matures, if you will, our view of leadership. If we're going to write a leadership brand and we want to understand what leadership means, part of that is, how did we get here? Challenging our own assumptions, revisiting our beliefs. It can be validating. It can invite a new way of seeing things and open up perspectives. There's a lot that can happen if we stop and reflect. And so that's what's important to understand that journey. So what do I mean by that? All right. So early in our career, we are focused on competence. We are learning our technical skills. We're learning our management skills. And by management, we're starting to practice as time management, project management. That's before we get people management, right? We are developing social skills in the workplace, navigating culture, forming workplace relationships. We're learning the rules, written and unspoken. What does it take to be successful here, right? So at this stage, leadership is positional, right? It's a title, it's a role, it's what those people in charge do. It's not necessarily something that I do because I still need to prove myself, right? That's the narrative that's going on internally. Our professional identity when we first join the workforce is just it's starting to develop, right? It's like you have ideas of what it's going to be like in the workplace, but remember that first day on your first job? Welcome. All of those ideas instantly have to become the way you're living, right? That's what's happening in the early formation stage. Over time, we start to develop a clear sense of who we are, what we do, and what are the next steps in terms of promotion and responsibility? Like we know what those should be. And for many of us, a couple of years in, leadership, right? This idea of quote unquote leadership, it's still a ways off. We got to get to the management level first, and then we can get to the leadership level. So I call this stabilization. This is the point in our career we have an established professional identity, a sense of who we are in the work world. What are we focusing on here now? Mastery, right? We're putting the finishing touches on the foundation that will be our career as we move up, right? We're looking at things like reputation. We're starting to understand that. Reliability, how does it influence that? Our influence is actually starting to grow because part of the reputation we're creating, hopefully, is being seen as one of those people that people can go to without me needing to have formal authority, right? So we're starting to see leadership as a situational thing. You have it, but it's not something you're given by title. It's depending on what the situation calls for. This is like when you hear people say things like stepping up and taking charge. But a word about that vernacular, and that's why it's still in the stabilization phase. Often at this phase, it's easy to overlook how much we are really understanding the way leadership is going to start to show up for us in our careers because of the lingo we're using. Phrases like step up and take charge can mean many things. It doesn't necessarily have to be just leadership. It could be process. It could be management. It could be ownership. It could be leadership. So when we hear people talking about using phrases like this, we have to be thoughtful about what does that really mean in terms of maturity of understanding what leadership means to me, to you, and to this organization, because maybe it's just, these are the words we use around here, not necessarily a reflection of what they mean to me. Now we move forward in our career. So now we're actually moving into management roles. Maybe we are having people leadership opportunities. We're the first time people leaders, or, we're only a few years we've had these roles. So at this point, we are translating what we've learned and observed, and we're putting it into practice. We are shifting from being good at doing the things that got you promoted to managing the people who are doing the things, right? So you're shifting from doing to enabling. We're navigating authority. We're understanding accountability, right? What does it mean? Because it's all changed when you start to move up the ranks, right? Our constructs and expectations of what leadership means, it's not theory anymore because our perceptions are being validated or challenged and asking us to change, or I'll say conform, right? So we want to be thoughtful because at this point, our leadership brand, our leadership signature and style will start to get cemented if we're not thoughtful about what that looks like, what that means, like how we're perceived, what I intend, right? Construct what you're experiencing, right? That's reputation. We need to be thinking about all of those things. So this is really the first time when many of us first question leadership, and we're no longer sort of idealizing it, if that makes sense, because we get it, right? We get it. It's complex, and leadership isn't idealistic. It's very pragmatic at this point. And so, like I said, if we're unintentional about this, those silent standards, those internalized modes, are going to take over, right? It's I'm like, what am I? I've turned into my parent, right? It's that kind of thing without really thinking about what kind of parent do I want to be. I just do the things that come naturally to me. But the challenge with come naturally to me is it's really learned, absorbed, and internalized. Again, that doesn't make it wrong, but what we want to understand is as we move up in our career, I'm going down, as we move up in our career, our view of leadership changes, particularly as it relates to our identity, right? Who knew there was so much work in trying to develop a leadership brand? You can go out there and read articles and blogs and look at these sort of systems. And I'm not suggesting any of these are wrong. The challenge with those is it it requires us to have done some of this work for those to really be deep and meaningful and a reflection of our values and who we want to be. So that's why understanding the definition of brand, what does a brand mean? What does it stand for? Check. Understanding what leadership means for me and how I express it, and and if that expression is what I'm actually intending to express, right? How does that all line up? So that's this maturity that we're talking about. All right, next stage. Integration. So it just got real, right? When we got promoted. So this is when we start to understand how this shows up in practice. Integration, right? So what are we focused on? When we're at this level of our careers, we're thinking about things like strategy, alignment, cross-functional communication, right? We're managing complexity, not just tasks. So what we might be tempted to do, and I sort of described this earlier, is like we're replicating the leadership that we've experienced, like we're turning into our parents, so to speak, whether it worked for us or not. So our perceptions of leadership, they're really less about control, and we're really leaning into consistency. We recognize that having authority doesn't necessarily mean you're being seen as the leader. You can have the authority, but still be perceived as just the manager, just the boss, right? That leadership energy that I talked about at the beginning, it isn't there. So at this point, we start to appreciate the importance of culture, on trust, on team building, on engagement and performance. And we consider how our presence affects those things. That's what I mean here by the social processes of leadership. These are the things, the processes that shape those patterns for us. They show up here. So understanding leadership now includes shaping the environment. So it's all of the things we've been talking about up until now. And now it's environmental, right? I am responsible for the space that people work in. It is my energy that is creating and building the momentum and the synergy and the connection, right? The trust. This is often the first time for many leaders that we start to feel the emotional and relational weight, how our choices affect other people. And so then we get to the stewardship stage. And so if I'm following the career pathway, right, this is the executive leadership level. We are at the organizational leadership level. And to be clear, you can reach these levels of awareness at different points in the career, but I was trying to mirror the pathway to get a sense of how maturity, in terms of our understanding of leadership, rephrase, in terms of understanding how our understanding of leadership evolves and matures as we move up in our career. So at this stage, at the stewardship stage, what are we thinking about? Well, if we're at the executive leadership level or have a formal leadership role and title, we're looking at things like vision, legacy, ethical responsibility. We have to know how to hold tension, manage uncertainty, navigate ambiguity without, creating fear and anxiety in the organization. We have to anticipate the long-term consequences of the things that we are trying to lead people through and the outcomes we are trying to drive. That's a lot, right? So we've fully embodied our leadership beliefs at this point. We aren't looking at the checklist of what does the role require? What does my title say I'm supposed to do? Leading is now part of your professional identity. We recognize that the decisions we make carry weight long past the immediate outcomes. They may ripple beyond that intent across systems and people. They may go all the way out on timelines and horizons we have yet to see. At this point, self-awareness, in fact, I was talking about that in the definition earlier, self-awareness is a non-negotiable. This is no longer an exercise for personal growth. It's a leadership responsibility. And this is critical for you to understand your leadership brand. And that's because blind spots at this stage have very real consequences. We need to understand how our views influence us and how we are perceived by others. Because what we say, what we tolerate, what we prioritize or ignore, shapes that culture, that trust, and that environment that we are creating now and over time. So how does all of this then come together when we think about our brand as leaders? So when you look at the definition of brand and reputation, it's, as I said earlier, they almost merge into the thing that we think of as a professional brand. And so it helps us to look at it through this lens in terms of that maturity pathway. So on the left, right, a personal brand then is the reputation that we develop early on. It's what we're good at. It's what we can be relied on for. It's not centered on me. It is centered on me, and it's not the organization, right? It's about how I show up and do my work. We progress forward in our career. We get to the level we are established professional. We are a known commodity, if you will. We're developing a professional brand. So this is adding on to that personal brand things like reliability, relatability, how we work with each other. Moving along the pathway, then our leadership brand builds on that. And what it does is it adds into the equation now how you're known for how you lead people, the influences that you have on outcomes, the environment that you're creating, right? So it shifts. If personal brand is understanding you, professional brand is understanding what it's like to work with you, and leadership brand is understanding what it's like to work for you. That is a way to really think about this. So I wrote my own definition of a leadership brand. And I'm realizing now I probably should have put it on the slide, but let me read it to you. The identity and reputation of a leader. So a leadership brand is the identity or reputation of a leader earns over time. It's based on what their values, actions, choices, and it's based on their values, actions, and choices and behaviors. And it's a reflection of how the leader shows up, how they're experienced by others, and the trust and credibility that result. Yeah, I should have probably put that on the slide. So let's walk through these three elements, and then I'll walk you through how all of this comes together on that worksheet. Pausing before we do that for questions. Let me just do a quick scan to Jane. You were defining branding and evaluating what people expect me to do. What I heard was, to brand effectively, I must make myself in someone else's image. Ha! Thank you, Jane. Thank you for clarifying that. I must make myself in someone else's image. I think that is a common way we see branding when we're trying to market products, right? We're trying to imagine what the consumer, the buyer of that product needs, and then position ourselves to look like that. When it comes to branding from a professional perspective for who we are, understanding how people are experiencing me is important. I'm signaling the things that they can expect from me. Those signals then determine and set for them what they think they can rely on me for. And understanding that dynamic is how is understanding my brand as it evolves, and then being more thoughtful and intentional about how I'm showing up to help manage that brand. So it's not about making yourself into what somebody else thinks. It's about getting clarity on what they think and checking for alignment with how you're wanting to show up, right? Hope I answered that question. What else is here? Okay, I think I've actually covered most of these already. Yay for me. All right, so let's walk through a little bit more into each of these elements so that I can walk you through this worksheet. Your personal brand. So I've talked about this. This is what makes you distinct as a person. So it's how you're recognized by those around you. So think about things like your sense of humor, your sense of direction, right? And I don't know why I thought of that, but okay, I'll explain. So my husband doesn't have a good sense of direction. And I have this sort of internal mental atlas or map in my brain. We did this thing one morning, and Gerard asked me, my husband's name is Gerard. So he asked me, do you know which way is north? And I was like, yeah, that way. And he looked at me like I had just landed from another planet because he thought, how can you possibly know that? He's not even sure what direction the highway is from our houses. I have a reputation for having a very clear sense of direction. It is a component of how he sees me. It's not the only thing, obviously. There are a lot of things, but my personal brand includes all of those things, right? Maybe you're known for your baking. Maybe people trust your advice on something, dog training. My son's a dog trainer. So all of those things, I shouldn't have used that one because that gets to professional brand, but you get what I'm saying. All of those elements, those personal descriptors are reflections of my values, strengths, and priorities to others, right? So it's more than the personality. I was describing our personality a little bit earlier. It's more than a personality, but that's a large part of it. It's how people have come to know you and what they've come to expect from you. That's a little bit of what I was trying to get at, Jane, with your question. So at this level, when we think about branding, and so we call it a personal brand, we are thinking about a constructed identity or image in some ways, because it's informed by our reputation. When we're intentional with our personal brand, it can get to us being mindful so that we are reflecting those things for how we want the world to perceive us. So this is things like identifying our strengths so you can lean into them. I mean, your strengths are your superpowers, right? This is about understanding how to show up and convey consistency, that the type of dependability that others need to build that trust, and really starting to better understand and notice those patterns that I was talking about that shape all of the factors about who we show up and how we're understood. The relational, observed, evolving, interpreted, resilient. Our professional brand builds on that, as I mentioned earlier. We now look at things like competence, credibility. It's how other people experience you as a colleague, a contributor, a collaborator. All right. Have you established yourself as the subject matter expert? Do people come to you for X or Y or Z? Because people now know you for that. And so as professionals, we actually start to begin to develop this brand, whether we intend to or not, and whether we realize it or not, because it's influencing how we show up and what people rely on us for and all of those things. So this is where that awareness and intentionality kicks back in again. When you're intentional about your professional brand, we shift out of constructed identity and move into authentic expression, right? And then we build on that some more as we move up, and we're now at our leadership brand, right? We have fully embodied our leadership beliefs. So the leadership brand, remember I said, is where we enter into that social process of leadership. Earlier in the program, I started the program by describing leadership as something people experience, that energy that inspires the type of connection, trust, and collaboration that actually is what's driving those results. And that energy is that social process of leadership, right? So saying it another way here, when you think about your leadership brand, It's how you interact with others to produce the results. So it's when your behavior shapes other people's experiences, what type of presence affects trust and clarity, creates a sense of safety, what builds momentum. People form expectations about how you lead long before you've ever led them formally, right? So where does this all leave us? So this is where I'm going to invite you to pull out that worksheet, because a brand is an image we want to project, right? We talked about that. A reputation is the effect we have on others. Talked about that. A perception, our perceptions and understandings of leadership started at a young age and evolve and shift as our career progresses. And whether we realize it or not, we're developing a professional brand that's a reflection of all of that stuff. So so here we are talking about, well, how do we then develop a real brand, like get clarity on what that is? And that starts with an understanding that asks us to have those two types of self-awareness I was talking about. So this leadership alignment reflection worksheet that I created will walk you through the process. So I'll show you. I'm not going to show you the screen. I'm showing you here the process. So the first part of this is what I called what's shaping your leadership. So the reflections for you are these 4 areas. For leadership norms, this is to surface those silent standards, right? Those internal narratives. It's noticing the things we've been replicating and replacing them with the things how we actually want to show up. So it's noticing I'm being just like my parents and reimagining, no, this is the kind of parent I want to be. This is how I want to parent, right? So what are those norms? The next one is exploring relational pressures, right? So the goal here is to identify what might be holding us back. Where might you be feeling pressure to do something or not do something, to start something, do something differently in order to maintain credibility, where you are now, it's pushing you toward inauthenticity rather than stepping into that authentic self, owning that truth, if you will. Internal narratives. We're good at telling ourselves stories. So here I want to invite you to really challenge your stories. And what are the beliefs that formed those stories? Why might you feel that pressure to conform that I was talking about earlier? Are you using the phrase I should? And asking yourself, where is that coming from? And then the fourth reflection area that I'd invite you to think about is your timeline, right? So are you making decisions based on the results you're trying to get right now? Are you making decisions and showing up in a way that you think is going to affect the future, outcomes in the future? Are you clear on how you're defining success as a leader? So that's part 1. Part 2, when you work on that, this is really about alignment of your intention. So it's surfacing those intentions. We all have intentions. They are below everything we do, but they're not always easy to identify, right? For example, our intention is to be helpful, but what if it's really about self-protection, right? Or maybe it's a need for validation. So it's really about exploring a little deeper what's behind our intentions. So the goal of this section in the worksheet is to try to identify those intentions and patterns. So what it explores things like your strengths. What do you do well? What are you passionate about? What do people come to you for when they need help? Feedback, counsel, right? It explores your communication. Things like, we've heard about this conflict management style. Yes, it's important to know yours, and it's important to know what the other ones are. And it's important to know how your style interacts with that other style to help you manage your communication. That's emotional intelligence, emotional regulation, all of those things. It explores ongoing alignment, right? What are the patterns that you're starting to notice over time as you start to do these reflections and look back over where this idea first came up for you, or when you started exhibiting this behavior, or when you first started hearing this kind of feedback, right? From that point up until present time, wow, are there patterns that you're starting to notice? And then where are you going to get some perspective? And feedback isn't the same as perspective, because feedback suggests I'm asking about my performance. Perspective is really about um, how things are viewed and how I fit into those views, right? So how are you doing that and how often? There's a fourth section on the sheet that's actually not on the slide, and that is really about your leadership vision. And you need to have that vision about how you want to be known as a leader. How are your values reflected in how you're showing up every day in your leadership role? Is there an aspect of leadership that is truly uniquely you? Like it's what sets you apart. So the goal of the worksheet, both parts 1 and part 2, is not to build your leadership brand per se. Remember I said it's kind of there, it's emerging. The question here is being intentional. You're not forming your personality, like I said before, you're shaping with intentionality the way you're showing up. So instead of thinking this as building a leadership brand, this is really about understanding, clarifying, and then intentionally evolving your leadership experience. The leadership experience, I guess I should say, that others have with you. The last part of the worksheet, earlier at the top of the session, I said I described developing a meaningful leadership brand by making sense of your patterns across the different ways we show up in the Ascend model. This is what I mean. Leadership brands, I don't believe, are distilling us down to a sentence, a beautifully crafted sentence. And instead, it's really looking across and reflecting how you're showing up in all of these different ways, right? And what I hope you get out of this process is 2 things. When you approach your understanding of your leadership style, how you're affecting other people, your strengths and all of that, it removes out of the idea of a leadership brand or a professional brand any sense of personal marketing, right? Like that projection or construction. It strips that away. And then it also is shaped by your insights, your reflections, your learnings, and your experiences. It's not rooted in what other people think. It's rooted in your values, vision, and truth, but aware of how you're showing up. And so on this slide, I've given you some examples of what those might look like. And I realized when I was looking at this earlier today, I thought I should have said, my leadership aligns with my values, but you get the idea. And so this is the worksheet. I invite you to move my slide. This is the worksheet that I was just walking you through, and I invite you to download it and walk through it. And then a couple of years from now, do it again, because remember, it's an evolution. So I'm looking at the time. I probably have about 3 or 4 minutes for questions. So let me go through. Gabriel, the new questions at the top or at the bottom? Like which way do I go?
They should be at the bottom.
Okay. Can you repeat the brand flow again? I think you're talking about, let me scroll. It could either be this, which is how people come to know us. This is really more about reputation than brand, but as we now talked about, they are definitely overlaying and are interrelated. You could also be talking about, and so I'll just show this one as well. It's kind of grayed out here, but we could be talking about this pathway, this maturity pathway that shows how all of this evolves for us as we move up. Somebody says, I think leadership is defined differently in various cultures and faiths. Absolutely. What we're talking about here is in the workplace for you and how you're showing up as a leader and influencing that environment. What does that look like? How are people experiencing it? Is it aligned with what you were hoping for? And if not, what can you change and grow into to help create more of that alignment? Somebody said their tombstone shall read integrity. Got it. I'm not sure what that means, but okay. I answered that question about who do I think I am. Somebody says, if you could encourage leaders to be intentional about just one thing that shapes their leadership brand, what would it be and why? You're not going to like this answer. It's being intentional. We do so many things on autopilot. Leadership is complicated and it's hard and we're busy, and sometimes the pressures can feel overwhelming. So the one thing, if you could only do one thing, it's to pause and check back in with where you are right now. And is what you're doing aligned with what you are intending to be doing? It could be as simple as the task you're working on, or it could be as big as the way you are leading your organization and what that looks like. If that's the one thing I can invite you to do, having an intention setting practice is what builds that muscle for awareness, which is what helps drive change. And with that, I think we're at the end. I want to thank you all, for those of you who have been with me throughout the series. There are several of you who I know have been here. And for those of you who are just here for the CPE, I respect that. I hope you got something out of it. And if you're interested to learn more about the kinds of programs that I offer, this was an introduction to Ascend, but if you want to learn more about the full program and what it might look like for you, scan the QR code, drop some time on my calendar, send me an email, message me on LinkedIn. Thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you on a future webinar.